Christmas and the seasonal holidays are a time of joy and celebration for many, but a big challenge to the mental health of others. Some of us are reminded at this time of the year about those we've lost and how lonely we might be feeling. No better man to equip you through this difficult time is Professor Happiness himself, Professor Paul Dolan. No relation, sadly. I'd love his genes. But Paul Dolan is the best-selling author of books including Happy Ever After, A Radical New Approach to Living Well, and Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. Paul has worked as the Chief Academic Advisor on Economic Appraisal for the UK Government's Economic Service. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel on wellbeing, and he's also a member of the Measuring National Wellbeing Advisory Forum. He's currently Professor of Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And in 2002, he won the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Economics for his contribution to health economics. Now, speaking of health economics, the professor has also gained a bigger reputation in the last 2 years as an articulate critic of many of the government's COVID measures. And if that wasn't enough, he's the creator and host of the hugely popular Duck Rabbit podcast, in which he invites academics, commentators, politicians, activists, and the public to look at the other side of any arguments. Professor Paul Dolan, welcome to the show.
Wow, thank you very much, Mark. I feel like I now need to live down to that intro.
No, you're definitely going to live up to it. Paul, are you a naturally happy person, or is it a skill that you've acquired?
Well, the answer for most people is, I think, both. I think for me, luckily, I think it's the former. I actually think I'm just predispositionally happy. I mean, not all of the time, of course. Proportionately sad. But there are lots of things, of course, that individuals can do, whatever their own individual baseline. And you mentioned happiness by design, and of course, I say of course, but as I outline in that book, the way you do that is by designing your environment, organising your life and your day in ways that make it easier for you to be happy without having to think too hard about it.
So what might that look like? Because I know both books are fantastically practical as well as very philosophical. So could you take us through a set of tools with which to manage a difficult day?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, if anyone were to prescribe to you a one-size-fits-all approach to being happy, they're probably selling snake oil. So I want to start with that very important caveat that it's for individuals to work out for themselves how best to do that. I think that all of us, having said that, are motivated to find a balance between things that we find pleasurable on the one hand and we find purposeful on the other. So fun and fulfillment, or other words that people might use to describe pleasure and purpose. And so, first of all, you're kind of seeking to find that balance. And once you've understood what that might look like, then you start engaging in activities that you find those kinds of balances in. So things on the one hand, fun, on the other hand, fulfilling. There are some things that are universally good for us, though, I think. Some of these are obvious but overlooked. I always feel a bit like I should apologise when I say some of these obvious things, because people go like, well, no shit, I know that makes me happy. But the answer is, well, why aren't you doing more of these things? And it is about making it easier for ourselves to do that, right? So listening to more music, to going outdoors, being with people we like being with, having new experiences, helping other people. All of these things are, if all of us did a little bit more of any one or more of those things each day, we'd all feel a little bit happier. And so, as I say, the key thing is in making it easy for us to do that, having plans that implement ways of listening to more music, going outdoors and so on. And it's interesting, as I was kind of reeling those off, which I've obviously reeled off many times before in my life, it isn't the first time I've said them, but you think about what some of the policy responses have been over the last 18 months that have taken away many of those things, right? Music, going outdoors, being around other people that you like being with, having new experiences. These are all things that have been significantly curtailed over what's now 20 months. So I guess I know you probably wanted to leave the COVID discussion until later, but I couldn't help but kind of, once I'd said those 5 things, it sort of really struck me that if you think about the things that have been taken away from us, they are pretty much all the things that have been on that key determinants of individual's happiness list, if you like.
And I think that's why you haven't been able to stay silent on COVID measures. And you would have had a quiet life if you had, Paul, but you took a different path.
Yeah, I would have had an easier life for sure, and a quieter one. I think I was struck very early on by the degree of consensus around an event or a condition and a virus that was incredibly uncertain. We heard the term unprecedented mentioned an unprecedented number of times. And so therefore you would expect there to be some considerable degree of disagreement about what the appropriate response should be. And it struck me, particularly amongst academics, of course not all, but most academics were very supportive of incredibly restrictive measures, the like of which we'd never seen before in the history. Well, as far as I am aware, I'm not a historian, but certainly, the most draconian restrictions on human activity that we've seen. So it struck me that consensus can't be, well, either real or certainly right. And the thing that I was most challenged by was what I've variously termed situational blindness, which is the idea that when we pay attention to something, it's important because it's in front of us. So obviously COVID, transmission risks, hospitalizations and deaths were incredibly salient. But what it meant is that we focused only on those outcomes. And we dropped the pebble of the policy into the pond, and we looked only at the splash according to those outcomes. And we ignored ripple effects downstream, all those effects on life experiences and life expectancies, right? I mean, even if you only cared about health, loneliness is right up there as being one of the biggest determinants. So you would want people to be socially engaged, even if you only cared about health, leaving happiness to one side. And I was incredibly concerned that we were ignoring all of these ripple effects whilst paying undue attention to the splash. And actually surprised that, given, I think it's hard to argue with anything I've just said. I mean, obviously you'd expect me to say that, but it is hard to argue with anything I've just said. When you're intervening, you want to capture all of the costs and benefits insofar as that's possible when you intervene. Now, in March 2020, we couldn't do all of that, could we? Because, maybe we might not have been able to because we were reacting very quickly. But we're fucking 20 months on, right? And it appears to me still that we're not taking proper account of some of these really significant and adverse effects on people's life experiences and life expectancies. And it kind of suggests quite a broken policy process.
We didn't have a cost-benefit analysis. We didn't think this through prior to the pandemic or in its early stages, which was a big mistake. It should have happened, but I guess a forgivable mistake. But your argument is that a year and a half, almost 2 years on, we've got the data now. We've had our cost-benefit analysis. We had lockdowns. We've still got a very high relative COVID death toll, very little to show for it, and yet the policies continue.
Well, I think even if you don't do a cost-benefit analysis, there should at least be a checklist of, a handful. Literally, it doesn't even need to be more than a handful of items that are significantly important consequences of intervention. Closing schools. What effects might we expect those to have on social development, on educational outcomes, on inequalities? Just having it on a checklist, having it salient in the minds of policymakers when they're making these kinds of decisions would be almost enough at any point. And so, sorry, I forgot your question.
Well, yeah,
say again. What did you ask me?
The argument is that you could perhaps forgive some of these measures, in an emergency in March of 2020. But what troubles me is that we don't seem to have changed the narrative or learned from any mistakes almost 2 years later.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that come to mind for me there. One is the fact that I think people, look, for you to be so supportive of the restrictions, you first of all have to assume they work. Now, I'll leave that discussion or some of that at least, to the epidemiologists who might be well placed to be able to discuss that. But it's at least questionable whether in the long run they've had an effect. And secondly, which is much more my own area of interest and expertise, that they're almost costless or transitory. And I think both of those assumptions are highly suspect. The idea, we've got tens of thousands of children missing from school. The numbers are not exact, but literally that are still missing. You know, they're not missing in nice middle-class homes being taught by parents. They're missing. They're in county line gangs. They're in places we don't know where they are.
Yeah.
Now, without a cost-benefit analysis, we should have had the foresight to be able to predict those outcomes. And secondly, it kind of raises in my mind this very powerful narrative to preserve life. You're a very strong moral person if you say, limit COVID at all costs, right? Because you're narrowly focusing on COVID at all costs. But at all costs are significant adverse consequences for the life expectancies and life experiences of the most vulnerable people in our society. So that moral high ground is in fact a moral low ground.
Do you think things will change? I mean, if you think about the psychology around COVID now, we've become very divided and different tribes have emerged. It's a little bit like Brexit, isn't it? You've got your pro-lockdown, pro-mask people, and then you've got your others who reject the narrative. How do you see this playing out, Paul?
It's a really good question, Mark. So it's certainly the case that a lot of what we're doing is faith-based rather than evidence-based, and people are falling into religious camps almost, as you I think quite rightly articulated. I think that the first thing to say is that we don't know. Anyone who would try to predict how things are going to be in the long term, given what's happened over the last 18 months, is going to be a fool if they think they can do that with any degree of certainty. The very simple but not very helpful answer is that some things will stay permanently changed and other things won't. The better answer is probably that most things won't change for that long. I mean, we have very short memories of things, right? I mean, you've actually been ill. I just heard from the intro the last week. I'm sure at the times when you were most ill, you were thinking, I must remember how great it is to feel healthy again. And of course, now you completely forget that you were ill. So we, kind of individually and societally, we have very short memories of what's happened. So most things will kind of, for many people, bounce back to some considerable degree relatively quickly. What I've been most concerned about, and what society and policymakers should be most concerned about, are the vulnerable people for whom that isn't the case. For those that already had pre-existing mental health problems, that the worst thing in the world would be to be socially isolated again. These are people who are going to be adversely affected, as I say, the tens of thousands of kids missing from schools. Their lives, most of those people's lives are not going to turn out well anytime soon, if ever. And so I think what my frustration, my anger, really, I guess, is that there haven't been more voices speaking up for those kinds of vulnerable people. And still, 20 months in, I'm not hearing them heard very.
I agree.
Hearing them held very loudly.
We're not hearing it from politicians. We're not hearing it from, in many cases, churches and religious leaders. We're not hearing it from the media. And we're not hearing it from academia. Now, the clock's against us, but I'm fascinated by your career because you are a top academic. Yeah. And yet, counterintuitively, you feel like a bit of an outsider. And I just wonder whether that's why it was your instinct to question the COVID rules when they happened, because I would suggest that most academics have fallen into line. What's different about you?
What are you saying, Mark? You're saying that I'm not a typical academic. I find that hugely insulting. I don't think I am.
You're not a dusty prof. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I totally know what you mean. I
You're
took
not
that
an
as the incredible. No. I'm certain. No, I have certainly been called many things in my life. I doubt very much whether that will ever be a term thrown at me. And I think maybe temperamentally, it sort of speaks to an earlier part of my answer, which is about whenever there's a received wisdom or a kind of consensus, I want to think about or challenge and question whether that's indeed the received wisdom, and that is wisdom. I think that we should be much more questioning and challenging. And actually, one of the reasons that I went into academia from the working class background that I did, which was rare. I mean, it's actually rare for working class kids to be in elite occupations, so called. I don't quite like those terms, high status occupations, rarer in academia, was because you could have a good argument and you could discuss things and you can thrash through differences of opinion and find points of similarity, find points of departure, agree to disagree on some things, change your mind about others. And it's the last 20 months have kind of really made me feel quite depressed about our ability to do that. And I think a lot of it is driven, all of us as academics and others too, think that we can come at evidence and data in a very dispassionate scientific way. And of course, we bring priors, we bring our beliefs to those kinds of questions. And academics, generally speaking, are very cautious, risk-averse people who actually probably don't mind working on Zoom all the time and not having to go into the office. So I can't help but think that some of that framed the way that many academics looked at the virus and looked at the restrictions that were put in place, because personally, they were actually doing all right out of them.
Yeah, that's the problem. And their paychecks have continued to arrive. Look, we could talk for hours. I know you're going to return and be a panellist on a future show, Paul, and I cannot wait for that one. I suppose final question really, which is how did you fall into this? How did you become a top academic and an expert on happiness?
Oh, mate, why didn't you start with an easy one or finish with an easy one? Well, look, I mean, we can all construct very coherent narratives about how we had particular coherence or, strategies or whatever. I think most of what happens to us is a sort of randomness that we then create a story about afterwards. I do remember feeling very lucky and privileged to be able to do something that meant that I could read, write, think and teach, not get my hands dirty, not risk my life, and get paid reasonably well for it. And that was a fucking privilege. I really felt honoured to be able to do that. And so that kind of got me into that threw me into academia. I think that answers the point about the so-called top academic. How I got into happiness is I think I've always been interested in the essence of human welfare, that kind of richness of our experiences that is the essence of life, the things that motivate us, that drive us, but that are not easily measurable and quantifiable. And I think I know this for the purposes of public policy, you need to quantify things for them to count. And so I think if there's one thing that coheres in my now nearly 3 decades as an academic, it's the sort of quantification of the unquantifiable. It's to ensure that policymakers take account of the richness of the human experience when they're making their policy decisions. I think that's the thing that holds my academic life together.
Well, we could talk to you for hours, and we love your strong views and your deliciously colourful language, Paul. We're post-watershed, so no harm in that, although apologies if anyone...
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry. Sorry, I didn't realise, I wasn't even aware of it.
Because you won't be cancelled on this show, and you won't be diluted either, Paul, after. Look at fascinating stuff. Your books are called Happy Ever After, A Radical New Approach to Living Well, and Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. Professor Paul Dolan is also the star and host of the fantastic and very well listened to podcast simply called Duck Rabbit. Brilliant stuff, Paul. See you in the